Hello, I'm Graeme Menzies. Welcome to my presentation about discovering Scottish botanist Archibald Menzies. This presentation was originally delivered by Zoom conference in November of 2020 with an international audience joining from the UK, the United States, Canada, and Australia. Wherever in the world you are viewing from now, I hope you will enjoy this recorded representation and will also perhaps enjoy solving some of the mysteries or participating in some of the challenges outlined in it. Before the presentation begins, I'd like to briefly thank Sue Barnes for her help coordinating, promoting, and co-hosting the event. At the end of the presentation, there's a short postscript which provides some updates and additional credits and sources. So with that all said, please enjoy the presentation. My journey of discovering Archibald began a couple of years ago at the 55-acre Van Dusen Garden in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. I was working on a book of unique and unusual things to see in Vancouver and heard about the bust of Captain Vancouver's botanist, Archibald Menzies. I found the bust located in the formal Rose Garden. Researching the bust further, I discovered it was made by a renowned Canadian artist, Jack Harmon, and remarkably, it seemed to be the only bust of Menzies in the world. Because it was such a rare and unique item, I put it in my book about Vancouver, but I was so intrigued and puzzled by the mysterious Canadian bust of a Scottish botanist that I had to find out more about Archibald. Wikipedia was a natural starting off place, I admit, but the information I thought was pretty bare bones. His life and career summed up in less than 500 words. 78 of those words are about his introducing the monkey tree to Britain, 60 words about his ascent of the summit of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And yet, as I was later to discover, these are perhaps two of the most inconsequential details of his life. So that said, let me tell you what else I've learned about Archibald, and let me hopefully add some color and context to these very bare wiki bones. To begin with, I learned he was born in a place called Styx. This was in 1754, less than 10 years after the Jacobite Rebellion and the Battle of Culloden. I've overlaid a modern-day Google map to help identify the location of Styx. If you look closely on the older map, you'll notice a place nearby called Croft Morag. I've now been to the Aberfeldy area 3 or 4 times, but somehow I never knew this place was in existence. I've never been there before, so this was a great discovery to me. Turns out that Croft Morag is a late Neolithic stone circle, estimated to be about 4,000 or 5,000 years old. Archibald's childhood home was located somewhere very near here, but I've not been able to locate the exact spot. This photograph of his home was taken some time before 1940, but the house no longer exists. In any case, I think it fascinating to imagine young Archibald climbing on these stones and growing up in a place that was clearly very special, if not sacred, to ancient peoples. One has to wonder if he was touched in any way by the magic and meaning of the stones, and if this is where he first experienced the mysteries of nature, the land, the trees, the plants, the rising and the setting of the sun. And this brings us to our first mystery: where exactly was his home located? Archibald's father was James Menzies, and James was head gardener to Sir Robert Menzies of Menzies at nearby Castle Menzies, located just 5 kilometers east of Styx. Head gardener was likely an important position within the estate, and this being the age of enlightenment, Sir Robert Menzies himself was a keen naturalist. Sir Robert recorded morning and evening temperatures and took barometer readings daily. And when Archibald was old enough, he worked at the castle gardens, learning from his father and the other workers, and perhaps even from Sir Robert himself. In any case, he must have been very good at his job, because his next step was to work at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh. Though I have no documented proof of it, my theory is that Sir Robert was likely Archibald's first patron and responsible for getting Archibald sent to the Royal Botanical Gardens and also for getting him admitted to the University of Edinburgh. But before moving on to Edinburgh, just a quick additional word about the Castle Gardens. As some may know, the Castle Garden is at least 400 years old, possibly older. At one time, the Castle Gardens was described as one of the finest designed estate gardens in Scotland. And in the late 1800s, the grounds around the estate were known for having some of the largest trees in Scotland. So while Menzies was literally born at Styx, his career as a botanist, metaphorically, was born here, in these Castle Gardens. Another thing interesting about these gardens is a nearby arbutus tree. I read a source that said it was planted here about 1781, although, as I'll explain later, I think it might actually have been 1791. The source also suggested this was the first arbutus tree in Britain. And this brings us to our second mystery. Who planted this tree? Was it Sir Robert? Did Archibald send him the seeds? Did Archibald maybe even plant it himself? Anyway, on to Edinburgh. Arriving there in 1771 at age 17, Archibald would spend the next 9 years of his life here taking classes in medicine, surgery, chemistry, and botany. He was a student and protege of Dr. John Hope, a professor of medicine and botany and keeper of the Royal Botanical Gardens. Hope had also the prestigious title of King's Botanist. The king at this time was George III, and it's worth pausing here for a moment just to explain that while the king would later suffer from some mental illness later in his life, he was in fact a very progressive monarch and was supportive of botany and science. In fact, as you can see from this image at the top left, his interest in agriculture was so well known that he had the nickname of Farmer George. He was also a great reader of books and eventually gave over 65,000 books to the British Museum, forming the nucleus of the National Library. He also had over 3,000 maps. He's regarded by some as the first scientifically trained king, and you can find his scientific instruments on display at the Science Museum in London. King George also agreed to build what at the time was the world's largest telescope for astronomer William Herschel, who named a planet after the king, Georgium Sidus, now renamed Uranus. And you can see it here in the graphic at the top, just off a little bit to the center left. King George III also founded the Royal Academy of Arts. He was a patron of Mozart, Handel, and Bach. He abolished slavery in 1772. He's credited for transitioning Kew Gardens, the world's largest collection of living plants, from recreational to scientific use. And most significantly for Archibald Menzies, he funded the scientific research on the Cook and Vancouver expeditions. So this relationship between King's gardener John Hope and the king himself would be very important to Menzies. Before we go on to the next chapter in Menzies' life, I want to take another quick moment just to highlight a couple profound world events which occurred while Menzies was at university and which would shape his future. The first event I want to mention is the epic voyage of Captain Cook. Cook returned from his first voyage in 1771, the same year Archibald began studying under Hope at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh. The Cook voyage was such a big deal that it is famous to this very day. Perhaps it's made as big an impression on young Archibald as the Apollo 11 moon mission would make on teenagers and young adults in the 1970s. But it surely would have caught his attention. Some of the people who traveled with Cook on his voyages were his botanist Joseph Banks, a 14-year-old George Vancouver, a lieutenant colonel, and a naval surgeon called David Samwell. Menzies would know them all, but especially Joseph Banks. And that's a picture of him there. And there's Vancouver. Colnet, we don't have an image for. And Samwell. It's impossible to overestimate the influence Banks would have had on Menzies' life. He was among the first botanists to travel with those charting the world by sea, and is personally credited for bringing 30,000 plant specimens home from his voyages, 1,400 of which he classified personally. He was exceptionally well connected in society, and was, for example, a fishing companion to the older Earl of Sandwich, who later would become First Lord of the Admiralty. But more importantly, he was King George's advisor on matters related to the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew, and was responsible for sending other botanists on scientific missions. I found one example of Banks receiving a letter from John Hope recommending one of his students to Banks' service. If I dig far enough, perhaps I'll also find a letter from Hope to Banks recommending Archibald. Another significant event that occurred while Menzies was studying at Edinburgh, and which would affect his life story, was the American colony's Declaration of Independence. I'll have more on that in a minute, but for now, it's just worth noting that Menzies was a 20-year-old university student when this happened in 1776. Okay, now back to young Archibald and some further details I uncovered about his time at university. While completing his university studies, he was commissioned by his professor, mentor, John Hope, to collect plants from Ben Nevis for eminent English botanists Dr. John Fothergill and Dr. William Pitcairn. For those familiar with the area near Castle Menzies, it will also be of interest to note that he also collected samples of the alpine mouse ear plant from Ben Lawyers. One wonders if the experience he had climbing Ben Lawyers and Ben Nevis would encourage Menzies to make that famous ascent of Mount Mauna Loa in Hawaii many years later. Moving on with the chronology of his story, Menzies graduated from the University of Edinburgh, qualified as a surgeon in 1778, now aged 24, and conducted a botanical tour of the Highlands and the Hebrides Islands off the northwest coast of Scotland. It is said that he toured the Western Highlands to collect rare plants for 2 London physicians. And I think it very likely that these are the same 2 physicians, Dr. Fothergill and Dr. Pitcairn, who commissioned the plants from Ben Nevis. What they did with Menzies' specimens is something else to investigate on another day. Now, after touring the Hebrides, Menzies spent 4 years in Wales, in Carnarvon, as assistant to a surgeon. There's no detailed record of his time in Wales, but my own view is that he was actively preparing himself for a career of discovery and adventure as a botanist surgeon on an epic voyage, such as the ones by Cook and Banks. I have 2 theories about who he might have worked for. One is that he was assistant to Welsh naval surgeon David Samwell. Samwell was not much older than Menzies, but had sailed with Captain Cook on his 3rd voyage. And he was actually present with Cook when he was killed in Hawaii. The other theory is that Menzies worked for Welshman Sir Noah Thomas. Thomas was a physician to King George III. Is it possible that the king, upon recommendation from John Hope perhaps, may have asked Thomas to take Menzies on as his assistant? So for those keeping track, this is now mystery number 3. Who did Archibald work for in Wales? Anyway, if I'm right in thinking that Menzies' time in Wales was all about preparing him for a naval career, then his plan paid off in 1782, now aged 28, when he made a successful application to the Navy Board and was appointed assistant surgeon on HMS Nonsuch. The Nonsuch was a 64-gun ship under command of Captain William Truscott, sailing near the Barbados. This painting shows Nonsuch 4 years earlier in St. Lucia. That's the good news. The bad news is that the US War of Independence was not yet officially over. And the not yet fully independent United States had few ships of its own, so their French and Spanish allies fought many naval battles on their behalf. Menzies discovered this firsthand almost immediately after taking up his post on the Nonsuch, when she, along with 25 other British ships, was engaged in a ferocious battle known as the Battle of Saints, after the nearby Saints Islands. They were outnumbered against a combined force of 31 French and Spanish ships under command of French admiral who had just returned to the Caribbean after successfully battling on the side of the Americans against the British in the 1781 Battle of Chesapeake during the Siege of Yorktown, which is now regarded as one of the most important naval battles of the 18th century. The Battle of Saints was intense and was played out over 4 days. Imagine a total of 56 ships, each with perhaps an average of 50 cannon. That's nearly 3,000 cannons. 3 of the Nonsuch's crew were killed in the conflict, and there were 3 wounded. Menzies' surgery training in Wales was no doubt put to good use. It must have been quite an introduction to a career in the Royal Navy. And by the way, the French lost the battle, so it was victorious for Archibald's employers, the Royal Navy. In case you're wondering where exactly the Saints Islands are, they are here in this red circle area. Incidentally, at the same time, young Lieutenant George Vancouver, now age 25, was on HMS Martin, engaged near the west coast of Honduras, and he missed the Battle of Saints just by days, and that's the little red X on the left. After the Battle of Saints, Menzies served briefly on a 90-gun battleship, HMS Formidable, and here's an illustration of Formidable firing on the French ship Ville de Paris in the center during the Battle of Saints. Menzies then transferred to another ship, HMS Assistance, in 1783. HMS Assistance was based in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The US war was formally concluded in September of that year at the Treaty of Paris, so there was no threat of further attack, and Menzies was free to collect botanical specimens and send seeds and samples to John Hope in Edinburgh and to Joseph Banks in London. Along with the specimens sent to Hope was a touching letter expressing gratitude for Hope's mentorship. I think the letter also demonstrates the profound personal relationship and connection between mentor and protege. Upon his return to London in 1786, Menzies studied in Banks' library and herbarium, This is proof, I think, that by this time Menzies was just as well known to Banks as he was to Hope. And it was here that Menzies wrote to Banks, offering to collect more plants for him and requesting assignment to a trading vessel, a private adventurer, due to go completely around the world. The private adventurer he was talking about was called the Prince of Wales and was under the command of Captain James Colnett. Banks agreed and on behalf of the king appointed Menzies as her surgeon. This was Menzies' first circumnavigation of the globe, but not the first for Colnett, who, as I mentioned before, had sailed on Cook's second voyage from 1772 to 75. Now, for the first time, Menzies would visit South Africa, Japan, and China on his way to the Pacific Northwest. On his expedition, Menzies collected over 100 botanical specimens for Banks and also, for good measure, and out of sincere gratitude, no doubt, named an island for Banks. I think it was on this trip that he picked up the seeds for that arbutus tree at Castle Menzies. And while Colnett was busy setting up a trading post at Nootka Sound, Menzies was collecting plants and establishing relationships with local chief Makina. He said that Makina's sister-in-law, daughter of an elderly chief, and other women in the area were helpful and protective of Menzies. And it is said that he established good relations with the indigenous people all along the West Coast and in Hawaii too, including with the Hawaiian king Kamehameha. I expect his experience with the Scottish Highland clan system helped him understand these social and tribal arrangements, and his familiarity with the Gaelic language may have helped him learn local languages too. Returning to London after this trip in 1789, Menzies once again studied at Banks' Library and Herbarium. While there, he met James Edward Smith, the first president of the Linnean Society. Smith was a fellow alumnus of the University of Edinburgh and fellow student of John Hope. Menzies became a fellow of the Linnean Society the next year in 1790. And the society, by the way, is named for the Swedish botanist, zoologist, physician, Carl Linnaeus. And Linnaeus, as some may know, is known as the father of modern taxonomy. Which brings us at long last to the voyage of discovery. There were in fact two ships in the voyage, HMS Discovery in this picture at left, and HMS Chatham at right. Discovery was the bigger ship at 100 feet long and had a crew of 100 men, and because she was a survey ship, not a battleship, just 10 guns. Chatham was 80 feet long and had a crew of 45 men and just 4 guns. The voyage of discovery was a 4-year mission from 1791 to 1795, and the route went from England to Africa, to Hawaii, to the west coast of North America, then up and down the coast, back down to Hawaii for the winter months, and the final route home was down the west coast of South America and back up across the Atlantic to England. Vancouver's mission was quite different than Menzies. I had always thought that the Botanical mission was a key part of the Cook and Vancouver missions, but after all the research I did about Menzies and his relationship with Hope and Banks, and through them the King, it seemed pretty clear to me that captains like Cook, Colnett, and Vancouver would really have been quite happy to go on their voyages without the botanists, and likely only accepted them because they were also surgeons and doctors and could keep their crew in good physical and mental condition. In any case, the 34-year-old Vancouver, who had already been at sea for 20 years by this time, had 4 main things to accomplish on his mission, other than botany. And these were geographic. He was to search for the Northwest Passage to the Atlantic, and while doing so, chart the West Coast. The mission was also political. He was to establish British claims to the Pacific Northwest and to the Hawaiian Islands. It was also economic. He was to develop trading relations. And finally, it was also diplomatic. He was to implement the Nootka Conventions with his Spanish counterpart, and thus prevent the recent Nootka crisis, caused in part by Colnett's trading efforts, from escalating to war between Britain and Spain. Because he was successful in that last item, this is what the west coast of North America looked like in 1793. Green is British, red is Spanish. As you can see, the independent American colonies had not yet absorbed the rest of the continent. And unlike today, the British area of influence on the west coast extended as far south as present-day San Francisco. In fact, when Vancouver first arrived on the west coast from Hawaii, he actually arrived on what is today the coast of California, and he worked his way back up to Alaska and back down again. A lot of people don't know this, but the original city of Vancouver is actually 400 kilometers south of Vancouver, Canada. It's located along the Columbia River between the American states of Washington and Oregon. This Vancouver can be traced back to when HMS Chatham sailed up the Columbia River in 1792, looking for that Northwest Passage from the Pacific to the Atlantic. Another little-known fact is that the island located between downtown Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington, was named Menzies Island at that time. It was renamed by American explorers Lewis and Clark when they passed through the area some 30 years later. Anyway, back to Archibald Menzies. As noted, he had a separate mandate from Vancouver. His was not about map making, trade, or diplomacy, but was entirely scientific. In fact, Captain Vancouver wasn't even his boss. Joseph Banks was. It was Banks, not Vancouver, who assigned Menzies to the voyage, and it was to Banks that Menzies reported. This was a very special arrangement. Imagine being the only person in a crew of 145 who did not report to the captain. It gave Menzies a very special status on the expedition. Menzies' formal instructions were issued to him by Sir Joseph Banks at the request of Lord Grenville, the Home Secretary and then Foreign Secretary to Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger. Menzies was instructed to investigate the whole of the natural history of the countries visited, to examine beds of brooks, sides of cliffs, and other places in search of ores, metals, and minerals. He was also to note sorts of beasts, birds, and fishes. He took to the mission with great zeal and made major contributions to botanical science. He made many discoveries, contributed hundreds of specimens and artifacts, and has legacies at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh and at Kew. For those who are in the natural sciences, evidence of Menzies' accomplishments and activity are all over the place. His name is found on plants from Canada, the United States, Washington, California, Hawaii, Australia, New Zealand, on everything from trees to ferns, on moss, seaweed, orchids, flowers, roots, berries, onions, and more. Out of respect for his accomplishments, classifiers at Kew Gardens gave Menzies' name to several outstanding trees that he had collected. The Douglas fir tree, you can see here on the left, the arbutus tree in center, and the silver birch tree. But of course, I have to mention that monkey tree story. Menzies did not discover the tree in any scientific sense, but what he did was bring seeds back to England with him. The 4-year voyage was basically complete, and they were on their way home via South America. On the way, they stopped in Valparaiso, Chile, and the senior officers were invited to dine with the Spanish king's viceroy there. The monkey tree nuts are a bit like pine nuts, and the story is that Archibald slipped a few of the nuts into his waistcoat pocket, and the rest is history. This picture, by the way, is of a monkey tree in Kew Gardens. It might even be one from Menzies' seeds. The monkey tree story and the completion of the voyage of discovery is usually the point at which the typical Archibald Menzies story concludes. But it's not the end of this story, nor the end of his career in the Navy. In fact, after the voyage of discovery, Menzies served a couple more years with the Navy in the West Indies on board the HMS Sans-Pareil under Vice Admiral Lord Hugh Seymour, a veteran of both the American and also the French Revolutionary Wars, and apparently in his youth, a former drinking pal of the Prince of Wales, later George IV. Admiral Seymour was commander-in-chief of the Leeward Islands Station in Antigua. It was probably very prestigious to be assigned to him. And by the way, the Sans-Pareil was twice as long as HMS Discovery and had 8 times as many guns. And if you're wondering why the British Navy had a ship with a French name, it's because they captured it from the French during the Battle of the Glorious 1st of June, which was the battle between Britain and the First French Republic in 1794. At the conclusion of that assignment, that's the point at where Menzies' career in the Royal Navy actually ends. The assignment to HMS Sans-Pareil was his final one with the Navy. Over 20 years, he circumnavigated the globe twice. He visited South Africa, Madagascar, Shanghai, Australia, New Zealand, Tahiti, Hawaii, California, British Columbia, Alaska, Chile, the Falkland Islands, Rio de Janeiro, and other places, I'm sure. He collected hundreds of plants and cultural artifacts and made many social insights. But still, this is not the end of the story. After 20 years at sea, Menzies made a significant and ultimately very successful transition to civilian life. Immediately after returning from the Navy, Menzies received the degree of MD from the University of Aberdeen in 1799. I suspect it was perhaps an honorary degree or perhaps one he was able to achieve with the benefit of many years' practical experience. It'd be interesting to research that a bit further. But in any case, he became a doctor and a surgeon in London very quickly. He moved to Notting Hill, married Janet Brown, who Fran Gillespie advised me was sister to one of the officers on Vancouver's ship. At this point, he was only in his mid-40s, and it seems to me he began a whole new second career and a second life. I tried to find out what Notting Hill was like back then and to see if I could find his home. The map at left is Notting Hill 13 years before Menzies moved there. The one at right is a close-up of his neighborhood 27 years after he moved there. You can see Notting Hill was much more pastoral then as it is today, and one can imagine he enjoyed living near the agricultural land, Holland Park and Kensington Gardens. To give some present-day reference, I've overlaid a Google map showing the Ladbroke Grove area where he is known to have lived. He lived here and also died here on 15 February 1842 and is buried at Kensal Green Cemetery, and you can see that clearly at the top of the Google map. I've not yet been able to find the location of Menzies' home. One report said his practice was at number 2 Ladbroke Terrace. I can't quite tell from Google if there's still a house at that address, and perhaps somebody in London could pop by and have a look. But another clue suggested his home may have been at number 6 Chapel Place in Cavendish Square. So there's some confusion, to me anyway, about where in London he lived. Maybe the Ladbroke address was his home and the Chapel Street his medical practice, or perhaps he had 2 homes. In his will, number 6 Chapel Place is the address given for his executor, Charles Craddock, who was apothecary to Queen Victoria. Another clue, by the way, that Menzies' post-naval medical career kept him in close proximity to the court and to those higher up in the scientific community. So this is now the 4th mystery. Where did Menzies actually live? Is his house still standing? I found a tantalizing clue from the British Columbia archives, and I've requested this image from them. Maybe I'll be able to solve this mystery soon. And then perhaps we can see about getting one of those blue historical plaques attached to it. But even if we solve that detail, the greater mystery, now mystery number 5, is what did he do from 1799 to 1842? There are 40 years of his life that remain largely untold. I mentioned that Menzies was buried at Kensal Green Cemetery. The photo at left is what his gravesite looked like not long after he was buried. The photo at right shows what it looked like more recently. You can see his gravesite was as forgotten as those 40 years in Notting Hill. But that all remarkably changed very recently, thanks to an effort led by historian and author Fran Gillespie. Under Fran's leadership, and with the help of many of her friends and Archibald fans, an effort to restore the gravesite was undertaken and successfully completed in June of 2019. The picture at right was taken very recently and provided to me by Fran, who also advised that the grave is visited and attended regularly by local volunteer Shirley Kibbitt. This generous and thoughtful effort has helped bring new life to Archibald Menzies' story. And while that was happening in London, Ted Menzies and myself were hatching a plan to do something about that bust of Archibald at Vancouver's Van Dusen Gardens. Ted and I have a very long story to tell about this project, but the short version is that we both agreed it was very strange that there was only one bust of Archibald in the world, and that it was located so far away from his home. It seems strange to us that he should be so immortalized in this fashion here, but not over there. So we set out to have an exact duplicate made so we can send it to Scotland. Remarkably, we found and engaged the son of the original sculptor to do the job. It took quite some time to plan, but finally happened earlier this year. During the project, sculptor Stephen Harmon sent us some behind-the-scenes images from his studio. A mold was made from the original and then cast in bronze. It weighs about 150 pounds. And here's the original Harmon bust and the new Harmon bust. You can also see the resemblance between original sculptor Jack Harmon and his son Stephen too. It's nice to think that this project, which ultimately is about remembering and honoring those who came before us, may have in some way helped extend Jack's legacy through his son. It was an unexpected but very welcome outcome from the project. When the pandemic is over, we hope Ted will be able to present the bust to the Menzies Clan Society or perhaps the Charitable Trust, and the current plan is that it will be displayed in the Archibald Menzies room at Castle Menzies. I like to think that one day it will be outdoors in the castle garden like the one at Van Dusen Garden, but in either case, it will be gratifying to send him home. By the way, another thing you can see in the castle's Archibald Menzies room right now is this plaque presented by the Huntington Library Art Collection and Botanical Gardens in California. This picture was sent to me by Nick Menzies. It's very heartwarming to see Archibald receiving some of the memorials and recognition that were absent for so many years. And now this is where my story ends. I hope I've shown there is so much more to Archibald Menzies than the bare bones of his Wikipedia entry, that he climbed a mountain, found a monkey tree, and sailed with Vancouver. Far from being an obscure, little-known gardener, he was in fact known to chiefs and kings, like Robert, Makina, Kamehameha, and to George, and to some of the greatest minds and outgoing personalities of his day, like Hope, Banks, Smith, and Vancouver. In truth, Menzies was a highly skilled, gregarious, politically connected scientist, ethnologist, chemist, doctor, and surgeon, and a 20-year naval officer with combat service. Born and raised near an ancient mystical stone circle, he died wealthy in Kensington with the equivalent of $1 million cash in his will. He's an underappreciated adventurer, and in my view, perhaps among the least well-known yet most accomplished people of his age. I'd like to now end with 3 final challenges that I promised. The first is the art challenge. This presentation and everything I've learned about Archibald can be traced back to that one piece of public art that got me wondering why it existed. So I'm now a firm believer in public art, and I think it provokes a lot of discussion and conversations and research about the past. If you agree with me and Ted on this, then we'd very much like to invite you to join us in the bust project by making a contribution to its cost. Any amount is welcome, and tell your friends about it too. Go to the GoFundMe website and search Menzies bust. The second challenge is for the genealogists. Are there any living relatives of Archibald out there? He and Janet had no children of their own, but surely his 4 brothers and 4 sisters did. And the third challenge is a grab bag of mysteries. Where was his birth home in Styx? What was the full story of that arbutus tree at Castle Menzies? Who did Archibald work for in Wales? Where precisely did he live in London? And what did he do in Notting Hill for 43 years? And this was where the original presentation ended, and we had a very interesting discussion among the Zoom participants. I initially planned that I think we would have about 10 minutes for Q&A, and I think it went on closer to 30 minutes. We'll find out in a second, because we did record that portion of the original presentation. So we've preserved that, and we're now just going to include that portion of the original presentation here so that you can hear some of the questions and the discussion that occurred at that time. I tried to get that done in under 40 minutes. I hope I didn't go too fast. And I hope it was not too belabored either. So
I thought it was excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was very good.
Good. I'm glad to hear it, Tim. Thanks.
Yeah, fantastic, Graeme. That was great. Thanks, Sue, and thanks. That was just fantastic. I mean, it's nice to see all of those maps and illustrations and you know, because I've looked online and there is so much, but you have to dig really deep to find this stuff. And you found a lot of really good stuff. That's beautiful stuff. Thank you. It's awesome.
Yeah, I had to cut a lot out, to be honest. There's so many interesting things. I almost completely ignored Hawaii. I mean, I feel bad about it. He did so much in Hawaii, and I feel bad. Sue, you know, in Australia and New Zealand, I pretty much kind of just skipped over that. There's so much there, but
well, that's why I think there's room for a full documentary on him.
Oh,
I think he deserves it. I think he deserves a full documentary, because he was even here in San Diego, in Southern California, but he hated it because he was told that there were all these beautiful plants here in San Diego, and they arrived and there had been a 10-year drought or something, and there was nothing here. So he was really disappointed.
Yes, for an expert in seaweed, he must have found San Diego a little
Yeah.
shocking.
Yeah.
So I guess, Graeme, it's Ted here, just to expand on your question. Is there anybody on the call that in their ancestry work has any connection? I keep going back in mine, and a lot of my relatives revolve around the castle. Not necessarily Styx, but Dull and Weem and Portingal, but no connection to this individual. Is there anyone on the Zoom call right now that can make that link?
Link to what?
Well, I spent quite a lot of time when I was raising money to restore the grave. I spent a lot of time trying to find out if any descendants of his brothers and sisters were still around, not only for my personal interest, but to be allowed to restore the grave at Kensal Green. I had to prove that to the managers there that there were no living relatives who would object. So I spent a lot of time trying to trace any descendants of his brothers and sisters, and I wasn't successful. And we know that his grandnephew, Charles Geddes, had the grave restored previously, and there was a photograph of it that Graeme showed. But I haven't even been able to trace his family. And believe me, I put a lot of work onto it, but I was not successful.
Fran, do you have any insights on his home as well? I was a little confused. It seems to be there's the Lansdowne evidence, and then there's the other place too. I've just forgotten the address, but there's like two places that keep coming up.
You mean wait, oh, those two places? Well, I know that I think he lived at number 2 Ladbroke Terrace, but I'm not sure about that. But that's where the funeral took place from, you see, and that's why I think he must have been living there, at least at the time that he died. Because I've got a complete record of his funeral arrangements and his will, and it mentions 2 Ladbroke Terrace. So I think he must have been living there, but he certainly owned number 6 Chapel Place, and I think that Charles Craddock, his friend, was living there at the time as well.
I was wondering too if maybe number 6 was the where the medical practice was.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
He was a member of the Linnean Society, Graeme. I don't know whether there are old records in the Linnean Society that might show the addresses of members. I have come across his name, when you're looking at minutes of the Linnean Society and that sort of thing, talking about members, and Menzies is listed there, as a member, obviously. But I don't know whether the Linnean Society might have some records that might help with the address matter.
Well, it did a little bit, and that's where I found out about the number 6 Chapel Street.
Right.
But then I thought, well, that doesn't necessarily mean it's his home. He might have been writing from the office.
Yeah.
So I know he's got that association with these 2 addresses, and I'm just dying to figure out which one was the actual, where did he go to bed at night? I want to know that one. And following that too, I want to know if either of those places is actually still there, because it would be kind of fun if we could get a blue plaque, a historical marker put on there.
If COVID would let us travel, we could easily spot it.
Yes. And then the other one related to that I'm kind of excited about too is the business around Croft Morag, and to see if someone might be able to find out where the original family home was. I understand it's not there now, but it's not exactly a highly developed urban place. There may still be.
Yeah, you would think there would be a foundation or something left, because there's nothing around there with the standing stones. There are a couple of structures, but nothing. You would think there would be something there.
One for you, Fran, isn't it? You're the one nearest and on site.
Yeah, I'll go along and check tomorrow. But I know the owner of Balfrax, you know where it was, so I can certainly ask them if they know exactly where Styx House was situated. It was some distance away from the actual castle of Styx. I mean the Neolithic ring of Styx, and in fact I believe the name was taken from that, but I don't know exactly how far away it was. I'd often wondered how the Menzies got across to the castle when Archibald and his brothers and his father were working at the castle, how they got across. And in fact, there was a ferry directly opposite that stretch of land where they were living. So it would have been quite easy. They'd just get the ferry across and walk up to the castle. It'd be quite a quick journey, in fact.
Fran, do you think that was a daily commute? Or is this, where they would have gone over the ferry and stayed at the castle and lived there?
They would, no, he would have lived at home and they would have commuted every day.
But the daily commute, Graeme. People went miles to work. There are plenty of records of people in that era traveling several miles to work and several miles back home.
True, yeah.
Well, I've wondered because I've sometimes looked at the census, and they've got the census about who is, at the castle. And there's a whole bunch of people there, and the description of their trade is a gardener. And I thought, maybe did the gardening staff live in residence, or?
There would have been some resident gardening staff, because a large set of gardens like that would have had a gardener's house and some bothy facility where under gardeners would have lived. But yeah.
Fran, was the Styx on the Balfrax estate?
Yes. As far as I understand, it was. Yeah, and I can check up with the owners to see if they know where the site was. And I don't know exactly when it was pulled down. I'd like to find that out, and I haven't been able to.
Here, I don't know if you can hear me. I would hope that the London addresses could be investigated via census records. I don't know exactly when they started, but I'm sure they exist, I'm guessing about at least 1801. And since he died in 1842...
there are no the census record in the UK with addresses doesn't start until 1851.
1851? Oh,
1851. There's an 1841 census. Is the earliest written census that record is 1841.
I was driving around anyway.
And that gives very little about addresses and things. You get a bit more information by 1851. Menzies is, you pick Menzies up in the 1841 census, certainly. Because he didn't die until 1842, did he? So
he did.
He should be around. If he's 1842 died, he should be in the 1841 census.
That's a possibility.
I'll have a look for you. Shall I log on now?
Oh, great. At least you have the addresses.
This is true. Now, Graeme, I know you disparage the monkey puzzle tree, but I'll see if I can put this up for you all. That's the only known photograph in the world of one of the original monkey puzzle trees that Archibald Menzies brought back with him in 1795.
Oh.
Oh, that's amazing. Which book is that in?
That's in my book.
Oh,
and where was that?
Arakaria the monkey
Where
puzzle.
is it? Arakaria the monkey puzzle.
I inherited that monkey puzzle from my picture from my grandmother, because the tree was cared for by my great-great-grandfather. And you mentioned Lord Grenville in your talk.
yes.
Who obviously was involved in putting Menzies on board the ship with Vancouver. Well, Lord Grenville was my great-great-grandfather's boss. He was his head gardener. And that tree you've just seen the photograph of was given to Lord Grenville by King William IV, who came after George III, because it had been stuck in a flower pot in Kew Gardens for 40 years, and they wanted rid of it.
That's incredible.
Janet,
So in 1830, the king said, "Here, you can have it," and he gave it to Grenville, and he put it in his arboretum. And my great-great-grandfather cared for it and looked after it and turned it into a nice-looking tree. A relatively small tree, because 40 years in a pot at the start of its living life didn't do it much good. But,
They're pretty tough,
That's
though.
amazing.
Those trees are.
That's absolutely amazing. No, it's one of the things, as I do disparage the monkey tree. I'm sorry, but I find it's actually one of the very interesting things about his story is that all these things and all these adventures.
Sorry to stick a pin in it, but he didn't pick his seeds up at a meal.
But he's on
That's the story. That's the story, and it's the one of the funny things about the Archibald.
It's not the story anymore, Graeme, because I've rewritten it in my book.
Good. Well, we'll have to make sure that we post a link to that later so that we can get a copy of it and find out where to buy it.
I have the link.
Well, it's on the Menzies website, isn't it, Fran? Didn't you put it on the Menzies the Menzies website?
No,
Yes.
And it's also on our Facebook page and also the clanmenzies.org website. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to be buying your book, and I look forward to reading all about it.
If I can throw something in here, I've been interested in that monkey puzzle tree too. We have them around here in Seattle as a landscape tree. So you see them. And if you look at photographs of the monkey puzzle tree forests in South America, the tree is quite different looking than the one that you see growing in yards and the full bushy tree that you see in photographs. It's a tree that only in the crown does the branches spread out, and it's got a very sparse trunk in a mature forest. So it's much different looking in a mature forest than you see growing one here, one there in somebody's yard. And I've always found that to be kind of interesting.
I think that's when they mature. When they get very old, they start dropping everything from the bottom and start turning into more like a cedar or like a pine tree. Yeah,
exactly.
They all finish up as umbrella trees.
Yes.
They finish as an umbrella tree?
Yeah,
well,
they do.
You've only got the canopy at the top and a big single stalk in the middle.
Yeah. That's exactly what the pictures show on it. And so it's a completely different looking tree when it's mature than it is when, although the trees growing in the gardens around here, they're quite mature too, but they don't have the years behind them that they do in a mature forest. So I've always thought that was kind of interesting. So
and they're very old too. I mean, aren't they like 130 million years or something?
They're an ancient tree.
The dinosaurs wouldn't eat them.
Right. That's why they lost the lower branches, so they weren't food for the dinosaurs.
Yeah, the dinosaurs wouldn't eat them. Even dinosaurs wouldn't touch them. They're very sharp, trees. So that kind of helps them all these years.
I'm a Douglas fir fan myself around here. We have Douglas firs. We don't have monkey puzzle trees. We have Douglas fir forests. And that's how I came to know about Archibald Menzies, was learning that the name for the Douglas fir was named after Menzies. That was my introduction. So, and that was many, many, many years ago. So,
does anyone know about the arbutus tree outside the castle garden? Is that true that it could possibly be the first one in Britain? That seemed rather remarkable to me, but that's what I read.
Well, I don't think there's very many of them, and the little I've read does suggest it's quite an old one. It's a beautiful tree if you've seen it in the flesh.
No, I've probably walked right past it and just didn't pay any attention.
Because it's not in the main garden. It's about 80 feet to the west of the garden. But when you see its trunk with all of the different colours of this peeling bark, it really is quite spectacular.
It's a beautiful tree. Yeah.
You may know that there is one inside the walled garden.
Very, very skinny one. Yes, it's pretty. It was swamped by big trees and didn't have a chance to grow. It's more like a stick.
Yeah. I think it may have seeded itself from the one outside the wall.
Must have been a big, strong birdie.
Or a strong
They
wind.
gripped it by the husk.
You may or may not know the oldest tree on the planet is not that very far away from English Castle. It's up at Fortingal, the yew tree.
Right. Magnificent wreck of a tree.
Well, certainly in Europe, I think that the Americans claim the oldest tree as well, though. Is it not the stone pine?
Yeah, in the Sierra Nevada, yeah. Those trees are 3,000 years old, 4,000 years old.
The Americans would claim it.
Yeah, if the tree hasn't burned down because of our droughts. But
Sean, the Fortingal tree is 5,000 years old.
Oh, is it 5? Can that be proven?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I just say something here? I'm actually the Perthshire tree warden in charge of the Fortingal yew, and I check on the tree all the time. I have film crews coming to film it constantly. We've had 4 crews in the last 3 months. The last crew were Americans. They came on Monday. I'm constantly talking to people about the Fortingal yew. The Fortingal yew hangs over my garden, so I could hardly be nearer to the tree. It is not thought to be older than 2,000 years. There are no yew trees in Britain thought to be older than 2,000 years. And if the tree is 2,000 years, which we don't know, but we assume it was already on that site when the first Christian church was established on the site in the late 7th century. And it's thought that the church was established there on what was already a sacred site, and that the tree would have been there in the 7th century. Beyond that, we cannot prove its age. But the latest research published in the Foresters Journal in July 2019 is something called the Unified Tree Theory, and they think that there are no yew trees older than 2,000 years. So I'm afraid the yew tree of Fortingal, although it's a very venerable tree, can't claim to be the oldest tree on the planet. Possibly.
Thank you very much.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fran, for that update.
Thank you. I mean, Sean, that means you win, Sean.
Yay! What do I get?
You get a
I get
tree.
10 years old.
Does anybody know?
Because of COVID. Fran, do they maintain the Fortingal yew at all, or are they just letting it do its thing?
It does its thing, and I check on it every 4 days and make sure it's okay. You know, we have people shoving lighted candles through the bars of the gate, so one does have to keep an eye on the tree. And I see to its welfare and clear its enclosure every so often, and answer questions from the thousands of tourists who come every year. We get so many visitors to that tree, it's amazing, even at this time of year in the dead of winter. As I say, we've had 4 film crews in the last 3 months making films, 1 from the BBC.
Well, so Fran, what do you think about this arbutus tree then? Do you think it's possible that it's the first in Britain?
I don't know. I just don't know. I know that there isn't one in the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, and we have 2 at Castle Menzies, so we're very lucky in that respect. But I don't know when that tree could have been planted.
Is there a way to? Is there a scientific way to measure it without chopping it down to determine how old it is?
I suppose they could do a core to count the tree rings, but I don't know. I mean, you know, you'd have to ask a forester about that. I wouldn't know.
Fran, I wonder if you know how the arbutus was given to the tree. Fran?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Yeah, I wonder if you know how the name arbutus was given to the tree. And my second question is, I heard that the arbutus trees at Castle Menzies have a blight of some kind. Is that true?
I'm afraid I don't know about arbutus trees at all. I don't know a lot about trees apart from the Fortingal yew, which I happen to look after. So you'd have to ask somebody who's knowledgeable about that.
There are 2 trees at the castle. There was the big one that there was the photograph of, and I've never heard anybody saying that it is unhealthy. It looks very healthy. Yeah. But the other one that's up in the garden, which Rory was mentioning, it's in amongst a whole bunch of other trees, and it has had other trees growing up very close to it over the years. So in fact, the tree is only about 6 inches wide and extends up to a very thin single stem with no side branches at all. So the one that's in the castle grounds is very poor. I actually suggested a couple of years ago that we should chop it off at about 8 feet and try and re-encourage growth at the bottom to try and get some side branches, because where it is just now, it's just useless.
We have a lot of arbutus trees along this western coast, so I'm familiar with the tree. It's beautiful.
I've got one growing in my garden,
Oh, how
so I'm
lovely.
planning on sending it north at some stage.
And where are you located?
In Marlow, Buckinghamshire.
Oh, lovely.
I bought one, and they're very rarely available in Britain, but I found one nursery in Devon, and that was with great difficulty finding it. And I bought 2, but unfortunately this summer my nominated waterer didn't do his job properly, so one of them's died, and the other one's still going strong.
Oh no!
Quite a few in the parks round about here. That's I don't. Can you see that, or is it too far? Yeah, there's a whole line of them in a park I was in with my daughter recently. That's the madronias with Kirsty, and I've got lots of pictures of the Mingus one. I've got lots of pictures of that. It's a bit tatty looking, but
it looks like something happened to it years and years and years ago.
It looks like lightning hit it or something. It's growing in a very odd way. I'm not sure about blight, if that was Michelle's question. Yes. But there's definitely something happening to it.
I think it looks fantastic.
It's beautiful. The bark is magnificent, though.
Yes.
Is the swing still hanging from it, Pauline?
It wasn't this year. We somebody was up there looking around the cottages and stuff while we were doing what we were doing in the summer, and the swing wasn't there. No.
Oh, okay.
I think maybe the people who were in the house that was for sale took down the swing, because they had a swing and a ladder there. But, but it's still a beautiful tree. Just a pity we couldn't move it into our garden instead of the stick-like one that we have.
Or move the garden.
Well, if Alan's
move the garden to surround the tree.
True. If Alan's one grows, we'll take it up there and put it in the garden.
How big is the tree?
Mine are only 2 feet high.
No, the one in Graham's photo shoot. How big is that one?
30. How big would you say the one behind the castle is? 30?
40 feet? I'm not very good at meters. 40 feet?
Yeah. It looked fairly small to me. We've got one on Galiano Island here that is, I saw this past summer, and I was blown away by it. It's just massive. The trunk is probably 4 to 4.5 feet across. It's just huge.
Oh, wow.
And I'm just wondering if the size relates to age at all in this case.
Here in Puget Sound, there's lots and lots of arbutus trees, and they hug the shoreline. You see a lot of them above the beach, the saltwater beaches. So Archibald would have been very familiar with that tree as he was surveying Puget Sound. He would have encountered it every place he went. And it's a magnificent tree. It's very beautiful. It's not as hardy as I'd like to see in some trees, but it is a very gorgeous tree.
I just want to say, I noticed that
2 years ago.
In Mingus Gardens. I know it's too.
I was just going to say, I noticed that Shirley Kivett is on the call, I think. Shirley, and if you can unmute yourself, say hello. But also thank you for taking care of Archibald's grave. I understand you tend to it frequently and make sure it's looking beautiful. And I'm sure everyone on the call would join me in thanking you for that work. Thank you, Shirley.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shirley.
Beautiful.
One piece of rather sad news to give you, Graham. I've just searched the 1841 census. There are 23 Menzies with birth dates round about Archibald's date of birth. Sadly, no Archibald Menzies.
Oh.
Huh.
He obviously skipped the 1841 census. He dodged it. Never got recorded.
Mystery man.
Mystery man, I'm afraid.
Was he Church of England?
I read
the census was
Presbyterian.
irrelevant as far as the religion was concerned. The census was a head count of everybody in the country, but the 1841 is notorious for missing people. It was a bit hit and miss.
I read that he was baptized at the old kirk, which is a Presbyterian.
Yeah, he was baptized at the Church of Scotland Kirk at Weem, and when we had the dedication ceremony for his restored grave, I asked a Church of Scotland minister to come along and lead the prayers, because I think that's what he would have wanted.
I'm sorry, would there be any records, church records or rectory records that would show that at least for his funeral?
That he was baptized at the Weem church, yes. Yeah, he's in the baptismal records there.
Baptismal, yes, but what about funeral?
About the funeral? I don't know. There was a minister present, but I can't remember offhand whether it was a Church of Scotland minister. I'll have to check.
The reason I ask is that if he was a wealthy person, then it could be that he would have a well laid out funeral. And there may be some community record, at least in the local, I don't know if they had newspapers then, but in the rectory record, perhaps.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry.
Is this to look for his address in London, you mean, Royce?
Well, close to that, or at a church where a very wealthy person would likely have a funeral. So it may not be right next door, but it could be where his baptismal records are, or if people had a habit of having funerals in the same church, and I don't know that they did.
Okay. How do you find that out?
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think maybe this is a good moment to conclude the session. It's been just a little over an hour. Appreciate it's been a lot of me talking, but I've really very much enjoyed listening to this conversation. I've learned a couple of new things, and I have at least one new book to go and buy. So it's been a great win from my point of view. Thank you for everybody for joining. Thank you to my sister from calling from Ottawa. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you to everybody on the call, Ted, Sue, everyone. Thank you so much for joining from all around the globe. I think Archibald would be pleased to know that, having traveled the globe twice himself, that here we are today, gathered from around the world to talk about him. So I'll wrap it up there, and look forward to talking with many of you in emails and on Facebook in the days and weeks and months ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Graeme. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Graeme.
Thank you
Thanks.
very much.
This was fantastic. Yeah.
Very well put together talk.
Thanks for giving me a heads up, Fran.
Nice to meet you.
All right, cheerio.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Since the live version of this presentation, a number of people have followed up with efforts to solve the mysteries and meet the challenges. So here are a few quick updates. First, regarding the location of Archibald's birth home in Styx, thanks to Graeme Menzies for sending a number of interesting maps of the area. This one shows a little rowboat that would have served as one of the ferries used to cross the Tay River, and perhaps the sort that Archibald would have used in his commute to the Castle Gardens. Patricia Gray sent a few vintage photos which show some of the Tay's ferry boats. The rowboat in this picture looks very much like the one illustrated on the previous map. Here's another image showing a slightly more sophisticated ferry, one that many would have been used along the Tay before the hydro dams were put into place. Going back to maps for a moment, Patricia also sent this one from 1831, which shows how substantial the Castle Menzies estate and gardens looked at that time. Now, regarding the arbutus tree near the Castle Gardens, Sue Barnes sent this picture of it, which she took last year. If it truly is the first arbutus tree in Britain, and if it can be tied directly to Archibald Menzies' 1791 voyage to the Pacific West Coast, I think that would be really something quite remarkable. However, Patricia Gray also referenced and sent to me a source from an 1883 book that references an arbutus tree of the Castle Menzies estate that was planted around 1871. Is that the same tree as this one, or is it a different one? I think we really need to get a forensic arborist to solve this mystery. Speaking of books and documentation, Graeme Menzies also resolved the mystery of Archibald's London residence by locating the 1841 voters list for the area. It shows Archibald Menzies residing at number 2 Ladbroke Terrace. By the way, if you look 4 names farther down, you'll see philosopher John Stuart Mill's registered as well, just a 10-minute walk away from Archibald's home. I think we can now firmly say that number 2 Ladbroke was the official home residence. As for number 6 Chapel Place, that must have been the address of his medical practice. I'd still like to find out more about that place. Gary was also able to find proof, unfortunately, that the building at number 2 Ladbroke no longer exists, having been demolished in the 1950s or 60s. So we'll probably not be able to get that blue historical marker put on it after all. That said, hopefully I'll receive the image of Archibald's home from the British Columbia Archives, and we'll be able to see what it looked like. But in the meantime, it's probably a good guess that number 2 looked a lot like number 3 or number 4, pictured here. Thanks again to Gary for finding this image. On the genealogy challenge, for a couple of days, we thought we had found some proof of a daughter having been born, but that turned out to be a false lead. So still no children. However, Fran Gillespie has filled in the gap regarding Janet Menzies' brother, Mr. Brown. He was in fact Adam Brown and was a lieutenant on HMS Chatham. Oddly, I can find no reference to Lieutenant Brown in various stories about the voyage. Much is said about Lieutenant Joseph Baker, after whom Mount Baker is named, Lieutenant Peter Puget, after whom Puget Sound is named, and Lieutenant Whidbey, for whom Whidbey Island is named, but not a peep about Brown. So as is often the case when studying genealogical mysteries, there's another brand new mystery for someone to solve. Who was Adam Brown? On the art challenge, many thanks to those who have responded to this challenge since the original Zoominar. I thought people might enjoy this picture of Ted Menzies at left with the original bust a couple of years ago and Rory Menzies center from some time before that. When the new bust is on display at Castle Menzies, I hope there will be plenty more pictures taken with Archibald, and hopefully that will be the source of some historical fun for many years to come. More donations to this project are always welcome, of course. Finally, I mentioned some books in the presentation. You can find most of them with a Google search. David's book is the one pictured here at right, and you can contact him at the email address provided just below the image, should you wish to order a copy. There's also a page about Archibald Menzies on the Clan Menzies website, clanmenzies.org. This presentation will get out of date in time, but the website is likely to have all the latest information about Archibald and other events and activities of interest. Thanks again for watching the presentation, and to Sue Barnes, Fran Gillespie, Ted Menzies, Rory Menzies, and everyone who has supported this effort to shed light on and discover new parts of the Archibald Menzies story.